Hello, my name is Oliver Hicks, and I, along with my project partners Kanhav Thakur and Fournier, will be presenting our research on Egypt and the Egyptian Arab Spring. I will be handling the country profile, while Kanhav will present on the movement timeline and Lily on our policy recommendations. Located in northern Africa, bordering Libya, Sudan, and Israel, Egypt is the largest Arab country and has a long history of influencing Middle Eastern politics, from pioneering pan-Arabism and Arab nationalism in the 50s to making peace with Israel in 1978 for the first time, to owning and operating some of the largest media conglomerates in the Arab world today. Egypt is also a member of the Non-Aligned Movement, which is a group of 120 developing nations who, beginning in the Cold War, held no allegiance or rivalry with any major power bloc. This is the second largest political forum of nations in the world, behind the UN. Egypt has a republican government with a semi-presidential parliamentary system, somewhat similar to the United States and other democratic countries. Egyptians have rights to equal protection before the law, rights to peaceful assembly, to organize in political associations, and to vote. They also have a president, prime minister, and a bicameral legislature. Now, despite this, and despite protests during the Arab Spring, Egypt has slowly returned to an autocratic government. President al-Sisi, who is pictured on the right, has taken strong control of a majority of Egypt's media landscape and its legislative body. For example, in 2015, parliamentary elections were seen as puppeteered by al-Sisi, who has a history of eliminating political opponents. Parliament then went on to restrict political rights and strengthen the government's hold on the media and protests. Egypt is also home to the Muslim Brotherhood, whom al-Sisi has launched a campaign to suppress and eliminate. The Muslim Brotherhood is not legally allowed to be a political party because Egypt does not allow for religious parties or parties centered around a single religion, but they have had a historically large influence in elections and Egyptian politics. In fact, they are considered the largest and best organized force in Egyptian politics today. Since 2013 and the end of the Arab Spring, Egyptian politics have been extremely polarized between the Muslim Brotherhood and the military, who is primarily led by President al-Sisi. The Egyptian economy has a history of alternating between free and socialized markets. However, it currently allows for both public and private ownership of property. The last 20 or so years have seen a trend of market liberalization that has increased foreign investment and led to macroeconomic growth, but that growth has failed to trickle down and keep up with an even faster growth in population. The Egyptian economy was also negatively shocked by the Arab Spring, as you can see by the two graphs along the right, whereas GDP growth was steadily increasing for a number of quarters. There was a pretty significant drop after the revolution, as well as a pretty significant spike in the Egyptian unemployment rate. However, they have since rebounded. Unemployment's at about 8.1% now, and GDP growth is around a healthy 5.6%. The largest economic sector in Egypt is agriculture, but they're also heavily dependent on cash remittances from Egyptians who live and work abroad. This is due largely to the fact that 96% of the land in Egypt is desert, while only 3% of it is arable land. What arable land does exist, however, is extremely fertile and allows agriculture to contribute a large part of the country's GDP and labor force. Again, however, rapid population growth and the limited natural resources found in only that 3% of arable land have kept the standard of living in Egypt low despite the country's large size. This is something that is not necessarily shown in standard macroeconomic measurements that track a country's economic development. And this also causes many Egyptians to work abroad, especially in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries where they work and then eventually send money home. Almost all of Egyptian society is concentrated along the Nile. The Nile River and its delta, with just under half of the population living in urban areas. This splits society into two fairly distinct categories of urban and rural society. However, in each, the family unit is the center of social life, while rural areas are a little bit more influenced by tribal affiliations as well. The national religion of Egypt is Islam, with 75% of its population being Muslim, and its national language is Arabic. Egyptian identity is strongly tied to these Islamic and Arabic roots. However, it's also proven to assimilate well, given Egypt's history of interaction with outside influence, all the way from ancient conquests to more recent decolonization and European peripheralization. Egypt is also known for its role in the arts, especially in literature and cinema, much of which has also been heavily influenced by the West. Now, all of this kind of creates a cultural authority in the Middle East that also lends to its role in the modern media landscape of the Middle Eastern region overall. Egypt is a major producer of press and media in the Middle East and Northern African region. Egyptian press is of the most widely read and most influential. Media Production City, for example, is the largest media and information entity of its kind in the region, and many Arab networks have a presence at their complex in Cairo. A large portion of the media is also state-run. The National Media Authority operates multiple domestic and TV satellites while also dominating radio. Since 2013, the government has increasingly tightened control over the media landscape. State-run networks continue to dominate television and radio, and many daily newspapers are operated by the state or major political parties. Because of this, Reporters Without Borders has called it one of the biggest jailers of journalists in the world because of a very hostile environment that has grown since 2013 and President al-Sisi's government has come into power. Few information outlets outside of the internet have been able to evade what is now referred to as Sisification, or President al-Sisi's tightening grip over the media landscape. However, much of this has occurred in the post-Arab Spring world. Before 2013, Egypt was known for having a wide variety of sources and ideological outlets, far more than just the typical conservative liberal dichotomy that we are so used to here in the United States.
All right, thank you, Oliver. So I'm going to be focusing on the movement timeline. And although the first set of mass protests were in 2011, often termed as the Egypt Uprising of 2011, I'm going to start a bit before that in 2010 to kind of give you some background and context for what actually sparked such a extreme reaction. So while it was Mohamed Bouazizi's act of setting himself on fire that ignited the Arab Spring in Tunisia, another death proved a symbolic catalyst for revolution in Egypt. In June 2010, a young man named Khaled Saeed was beaten to death by two police officers after being dragged out of a cyber cafe in Alexandria. Photographs of his disfigured body were shared online. Right here. So, while Ghonim, an Egyptian Google executive living in Dubai, who would go on to become a prominent Arab Spring youth activist, created a Facebook group called We Are All Khaled Saeed, which quickly drew membership in the hundreds of thousands. What seemed to strike a different chord within the people was the fact that Saeed had neither been a political dissident nor an Islamic radical, but rather just a young Egyptian everyman victimized by the oppressive regime. Small-scale local demonstrations took place protesting Saeed's death, but it was on Ghanim's Facebook page where the announcement for the protests held on National Police Day, January 25th, 2011, where it was first publicized for a day of revolution. Tens of thousands of protesters gathered nationwide, demanding their president step down from power, chanting, "The people want to bring down the regime." A broad spectrum of protesters, from labor and youth activists to feminists and Christians, sought political change in the wake of decades of corruption, police brutality, media censorship, unemployment, inflation, and just numerous other problems. The protests took various forms, from the occupation of downtown Cairo's Tahrir Square to labor strikes, acts of civil disobedience, and clashes with armed forces. Violence between protesters and the police resulted in 846 deaths and several thousand injuries. On February 1st, Mubarak attempted to placate the protesters with concessions, including a pledge to step down at the end of his term in 2011, and even naming Omar Soleiman as vice president, the first person to serve as such in Mubarak's nearly three-decade presidency. Did little to quell the unrest. Yeah, that is it. Yeah. And on February 11th, after 18 days of mass protests in Egypt, the people's voices were heard. Mubarak stepped down as president, leaving the Egyptian military in control of the country. The military, known as the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, suspended the constitution and dissolved the nation's emergency laws, with plans to draft constitutional amendments and hold a democratic election within 6 months. In March, Mubarak was charged with culpability in the killing of protesters during the revolution and was later sentenced to jail. It was a great moment of hope and aspiration, but also one of great concern with the uncertainty of the future. Many scholars warned that the country was neither politically nor constitutionally ready for elections. Pro-democracy activists felt that there was a lack of genuine political parties across the country that could actually develop policy platforms and compete for votes nationally. The only organization poised to win was the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist political organizations. The Muslim Brotherhood, which for decades had been involved in a violent struggle against the state, an enemy of Mubarak, had in recent years moved into politics and charitable work. They developed a nationwide network of members and supporters and had built up formidable organizational infrastructure capable of launching political campaigns. In January 2012, the Muslim Brotherhood won the parliamentary elections, forming the largest bloc. Following this, in May 2012, the presidential race boiled down to two final candidates from an initial 13 vying for presidency: Mohammad Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood and former Prime Minister and Air Force Commander Ahmed Shafiq. In June of 2012, Mohammad Morsi was elected with 51%, a little over 51% of the vote. Morsi retired top military commanders of the Mubarak era and appointed General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, sorry for butchering that name, as I'm sure I did, as Minister of Defense and Military Commander-in-Chief. His tenure was marred by protests against his rule and accusations that the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist parliament were trying to change the secular nature of Egyptian society and government. In October, a new draft of the constitution gave religion a more prominent role in the legislative and judicial process. Liberal and secular groups protested the forced insertion of Islam. Under Morsi's rule, crime soared, the economy was worsening, and inflation was skyrocketing. The government was not transparent or inclusive. As millions took to the streets nationwide in rival demonstrations, either demanding Morsi's resignation or supporting him, Morsi rejected opposition calls for early presidential elections and his resignation. Backed by the massive protests, Egypt's military, led by Sisi, moved in and removed Morsi from the office, 1 year after they handed him the reins of power. The move against Morsi deepened the political schism. Although millions of Egyptians had taken to the streets against him, large numbers also protested his forced departure, thus leaving the nation in a state of massive civil unrest and deepening the political and religious divide. In July of 2013, a court charged and detained Morsi with espionage and unspecified aggressive acts in the country, including links to attacks on police and security force facilities. And in September, he was sentenced to jail for a lifetime. Additionally, an Egyptian court also banned the Brotherhood and ordered the seizure of the movement's assets. The court alleged that the movement used Islam as a cover while it violated citizens' rights under Morsi's presidency. Next year, in May 2014, Egypt held presidential elections yet again, which was extended for an extra day amid concern about low turnout. On June 3rd, results of the presidential election, which had a turnout of about 47%, were announced. Garnering support after his successful coup d'etat, Sisi was declared the winner with more than 96% of the vote on promises of stability and improving the collapsing economy. There were suspicions that the elections were rigged. With Sisi's rise to power, coupled with his ousting of Morsi, Egypt witnessed a surge of violence by militant groups, some affiliated with the Islamic State. In November 2014, militants in Sinai pledged allegiance to Abu Bakr and ISIS, effectively setting up an Egyptian branch of the violent jihadist group based in Iraq and Syria. So you can see here, this is the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. It shares a border with Israel and is close to the Gaza Strip, and is the only part of Egypt which is actually in Asia. There were several high-profile assassinations that targeted members of the government that followed. A bomb attack blamed on Islamist militants killed Egypt's chief prosecutor in Cairo in June 2015. With ISIS-linked insurgencies growing, the attacks started becoming more brazen and frequent. Attacks in the next few years increasingly targeted civilians, multiple churches, and security forces. Whiplash from the brutal Sisi regime, rounding up thousands of political prisoners, to the rising militant insurgencies carrying out bombings across the country, Egypt was wrapped in turmoil. In November 2017, militants even went so far as to bomb a Sufi mosque in a remote North Sinai town and opened fire on the worshippers, killing at least 305 and injuring more than 128 others. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in Egypt's modern history. The entire Arab region was in chaos. The destruction of Syria, the rise of militants, the continued occupation of Palestine. This allowed politicians like Sisi to project an image of stability, particularly to the outside world. It enabled him to sell himself as a shield against the West's great bogeyman of Islamic terrorism, which was the cover he would use to blatantly imprison thousands of people and curtail basic civil liberties and fundamental rights of the people. Thus, Sisi felt even more emboldened, knowing that he wouldn't lose American military aid using this veneer of the war against extremist Islamic groups. In March of 2018, I'll just explain this here. This is a picture of the mosque in northern Sinai, and this right here is a picture of the car which actually had the chief prosecutor, which was bombed. Yeah. So yeah, lastly, in March 2018, El-Sisi was re-elected for a second term with 97% of the vote, with a meager turnout of 38%. He did not face any real competition. Serious challengers had ended their campaigns months prior to the election, and one was arrested. Citing intimidation, the remaining candidate had no intention of challenging the president. So yeah, that was it. Thank you. And I'll now hand it over to Lily, who will present her policy recommendations as well as give you just a quick and brief review of the past couple of years and the condition of Egypt to set the scene.
Alrighty. So I'm going to start with Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who is the current president, as Ali mentioned, of Egypt. Before becoming president, he served for decades in the Egyptian military. But following the Egyptian Revolution, Mohamed Morsi, who was the first post-revolution democratically elected president, promoted el-Sisi to the head of the Egyptian armed forces. Following this promotion, el-Sisi rose to national popularity. And in 2013, frustrations with Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party, which Morsi represented, came to a head with mass anti-Morsi protests. In response to these protests, the military, led by al-Sisi, seized power in a coup and removed Morsi, claiming, quote, the army and the people of Egypt are one. In the chaos that followed, el-Sisi and the military claimed more and more control over the politics of Egypt and dismantled democratic systems that had been put in place. Known as the Lion of Egypt by his supporters, el-Sisi is also responsible for the imprisonment and death of thousands of Islamists following the fall of Morsi. El-Sisi's dramatic actions built him a cult of personality among Egyptians who supported the removal of Morsi. These people pushed el-Sisi to run for president, and in 2014 he did, winning a total of 97% of the vote in an election without the participation of the Freedom and Justice Party, thus ending the Muslim Brotherhood's control over politics in Egypt. Today, el-Sisi operates as an authoritarian leader, repressing protests, free journalism, and political dissent. Last year, constitutional amendments extended el-Sisi's term to ensure that he will be president until at least 2030. And shortly after these amendments were passed, Mohamed Morsi died in an Egyptian courtroom after suffering years of isolation and neglect in prison. Mohamed Morsi's treatment in the Egyptian justice system is far from unique. Following the 2011 revolution, human rights organizations noted Egypt's move towards democracy as the possible beginning of dramatic reform. But despite these early glimmers of hope, Egypt continues to abuse human rights under el-Sisi. The Egyptian military and local police forces today have continued to torture and mistreat civilians at police stations and during arrests. Mass trials followed by mass executions also continue. The Human Rights Watch cites a mass trial and execution in 2014 of more than 1,200 people who were convicted in connection with the death of just one single police officer. In addition, el-Sisi's government has failed to enact legislation against intimate partner violence. Without government or police action, women and girls are vulnerable to female genital mutilation and sexual assault. Additionally, the LGBTQ plus community within Egypt is in constant danger of prosecution and jail time. The lack of due process and fair trials that characterized the pre-revolution government continue under el-Sisi. In 2014, the government created a powerful human rights agency, but human rights abuses continue in Egypt because this agency focuses on protecting the government from accusations of human rights and not so much on actually protecting Egyptians from human rights abuses. Much of the state-sanctioned violence, like the violence that immediately followed the coup, is directed at political dissidents, specifically those suspected to be aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood or other Islamist political parties. Violence against Islamists is justified by terrorism fears. Since 2013, the Brotherhood has been banned in Egypt and designated as a terrorist organization by the Egyptian government. While it's true that offshoots of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, including what's now known as Hamas, have become widely recognized terrorist organizations, the classification of the Brotherhood as a whole in Egypt as a terrorist organization is nothing more than a semi-transparent attempt by el-Sisi to demonize his political enemies. Fears of terrorism, however, especially in the North Sinai, are not fabrications. A terrorist organization that's now known as the Sinai Peninsula has been active in the Sinai Peninsula known as the Sinai Province, is now active in the Sinai Peninsula, and they've been active there since 2011. In 2014, the Sinai Province swore their allegiance to the Islamic State. Today, the goals of the Sinai Province are to convert the peninsula into an Islamic province of ISIS. And so security forces backed by the government wage a constant war against the Sinai Province in the North Sinai. And this tension between the terror group and the Egyptian government is exacerbated by the North Sinai's proximity to Israel-Palestine. As you can see, North Sinai shares a border with the southwest side of Israel-Palestine, including the southwest edge of the Gaza Strip. Historically, the US has seen Egypt as a key player for stabilization in the Middle East. The United States has been willing to work with authoritarian and anti-democratic governments in order to take advantage of the strategic position of Egypt in relation to Israel and to prevent Russia from gaining power and influence. During the revolution of 2011, the United States government struggled to agree on a response. Despite decades of cooperation between Mubarak and the United States, many in the US government were ready to take Middle East policy in a different direction. After the revolution, the Pentagon bragged that their aid had helped, quote, convince the Egyptian generals to accept democracy. Obviously, that didn't work out. At the same time, fears of the Muslim Brotherhood by United States diplomats and high-ranking military officials were stoked by lobbyists from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, whose leaders feared democratic elections of Islamic politicians in Egypt. In response to this lobbying, military leaders in the US began to argue that the Muslim Brotherhood was tied to Al-Qaeda. And General Flynn at one point said that the Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda were all the same ideology. In 2013, as it became clear to United States military and intelligence that a military coup was inevitable, the Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, was sent to speak with al-Sisi. The White House under Obama wanted Hagel to warn al-Sisi of the consequences of the coup, including the cutoff of US aid. Instead, Hagel, who was skeptical and distrustful of Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, tried to communicate a message of partnership with Egypt and their government, which would eventually become the government under al-Sisi. In this mismanagement of the situation, Chuck Hagel lost the United States a moment to use the country's aid and political influence to promote lasting democracy in Egypt. Even before this, many Egyptian people felt that the United States had already lost its ability to promote democracy after decades of support of Mubarak. By 2014, about a year after al-Sisi took control of the government, aid from the United States to Egypt had resumed despite the continued prosecution of Muslim Brotherhood members and political opponents of al-Sisi. Today, the United States, under the direction of President Trump and the Trump administration, has rekindled a positive relationship between the United States and Egypt. Last spring, Trump and al-Sisi met at the White House, and Trump has praised al-Sisi as a, quote, real leader for his ability to settle turmoil. President Trump has also pushed to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as an international terrorist organization. This potential designation will allow al-Sisi to further prosecute his political opponents. Beyond the benefit to an authoritarian leader, international agencies agree that the Muslim Brotherhood does not fit the classifications of a terrorist organization. It's less of an organized group as a loosely united people around ideology. And in Egypt, the Brotherhood has historically been represented by a political party. And today, the Brotherhood in Egypt and other countries pushes against violence, the violence of terror organizations like Al-Qaeda, and has promoted democracy and fair elections. Many international leaders and high-ranking government officials also support or identify with the Brotherhood. So a potential terrorist designation would make relationships with countries like Turkey, whose president is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, nearly impossible. Fortunately, the White House dropped this idea, but fear of the Brotherhood in the United States and Egypt still poses a significant threat to potential democracy in Egypt. Obviously, the United States does not have a great record on human rights at home or abroad, but the recent steps by the government to protect and entrench the power of el-Sisi are dangerous for the Egyptian people and democracy in the world. Today, the United States relies on Egypt for counterterrorism efforts, but el-Sisi is not uniquely qualified to head anti-terrorism efforts. Instead of limiting the influence and control of terror groups within Egypt, el-Sisi's policies further exacerbate the situation. The government has shown little to no respect for the humanity of the people caught in the crossfire of this violence, thus continuing a pattern of isolation for the civilians living in the Sinai Peninsula. By excluding the people of the peninsula from government representation and decision-making, el-Sisi inadvertently encourages people to turn to terrorism. Egyptian prisons are full of Islamists, including supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. So instead of limiting the influence of terrorism in Egypt, prisoners have become a source of recruits for the Sinai province. Political prisoners who are unjustly imprisoned and regularly tortured are easily radicalized in opposition to the Egyptian government. El-Sisi has also failed to limit Russian influence in the Middle East. In fact, el-Sisi has accepted more Russian aid than any of his predecessors. The United States sends more aid to Egypt than any other government in the world, except for Israel. This money is not being sent to suppress terrorism or to promote democracy, as the United States wants to claim. Instead, US aid supports an authoritarian leader who serves only himself. The United States should suspend aid to Egypt until the people of Egypt are given a voice and say in the actions of the government. At other times in history, US aid to Egypt has required positive movement on human rights. The US should resume this program. Currently, the US is prioritizing a sense of influence in Egypt over human suffering. El-Sisi does not serve the United States government, and he will not promote US interests. Even setting aside US interests in Egypt, the White House and the American people should be ashamed to support human rights abuses and authoritarianism in Egypt. Ideally, future US-Egypt policy would allow US funding of human rights organizations, but cut off funding for the current Egyptian government.